November 18th, 1860. This week, the debate about secession raises the temperature of the country. President Buchanan clarifies his powers as president, and Major Robert Anderson takes stock of his new post in Charleston Harbor. I'm Zach Hilligoss, and this is Civil War Weekly. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Civil War Weekly. Let's take a look real fast at what we talked about last week. Last week, the state of Georgia, called the Empire State of the South for their economic powerhouse status in the Cotton States, started a week of debates attended by the brightest political minds available to them. This cast of politicians was gathered together to debate the issue of secession in front of the Georgia State Legislature. The debates in Georgia are going to have a long-lasting effect on the Deep South, especially because a lot of the other states are looking at what's happening in Georgia as kind of a guide stone for what public sentiment and political sentiment in the Deep South is going to be. Last week, Fort Moultrie was, at least in name, put under the command of a new Major Robert Anderson of Kentucky, who will be arriving sometime this week. Down in the Florida Keys, we had Lieutenant T.A. Craven of the USS Mohawk taking a break from hunting slave traders and pirates to guard a couple of very strategically placed federal forts in the Florida Keys and the Dry Tortugas. Also, we saw current President Buchanan asking his Attorney General for some legal advice pertaining to what his responsibilities were in response to all of the threats of secession that were starting to come from South Carolina, and now maybe, depending on how the debates in Georgia end up, Georgia as well. So now let's catch up to this week, starting on Sunday, November 18th. This Sunday morning, the Georgia newspaper, the Daily True Democrat, published a pretty inflammatory article that I was able to find. The title of it is "Another Warning from the North." And supposedly it comes from an anonymous letter writer to the editor who is currently residing in one of the northern states. And he has this quote for his fellow Georgians, quote, "The hour has come when the truth should be told. Long years of unremitted abolition preaching has educated in almost every county in the North a more or less numerous body of abolition crusaders who are only waiting for the inauguration of a black Republican president to enter the southern states armed with torches, poison, pikes, and bayonets to complete the work of havoc and ruin begun by John Brown." How's that for high drama? Nothing like really stirring up the hornet's nest. But this article really does kind of highlight a principle that we kind of hinted at in episode 1, in that America culturally is very, very large. People in 1860 aren't living in the information age where everything can be vetted at the drop of a hat. You're not able to whip out a cell phone and check and see what's really going on the other side of the country. All of your news is coming from firsthand accounts or secondhand sources that have to travel sometimes upwards of a week or more to get to where you are. So the reliability of news across the country is like playing one giant game of telephone. And depending who you have editing that newspaper and which political bent they want to throw into the works, you're really at the mercy of whatever agenda your media source happens to have. Not that we would know anything about that in the modern day, but that's what was happening in 1860, only with far fewer fact checkers. While that paper was circulating in the streets of Georgia, the state legislature voted to allocate $1 million for the purchase of weapons to arm the state. Now in 2024, we hear the number $1 million and we don't think too much of it. We have a whole TV show dedicated to making millionaires out of people. But $1 million in 1860, after we adjust for inflation, is equivalent to about $37 million today. Now, $37 million dollars is a little abstract. We don't really have anything to compare that amount of money to. So I did a little digging. To put that into perspective, I looked up the 2023 Georgia state budget. And if I'm reading that right, and I'm not claiming that I know how to read a detailed spreadsheet like that, but just by poking around, Georgia spent about $37 million dollars operating the entirety of the Georgia Department of Transportation for an entire year. So imagine in 2024, Georgia looking at their budget for the year, and instead of paying for the Georgia Department of Transportation, instead of paying for all of their staff or issuing driver's license or license plates or, operating any of their brick or mortar buildings, instead they say, let's just take all that money and instead we're going to buy guns with it. And you might have a little bit more of an idea of what that meant as far as Georgia's intentions. And I feel the need to reiterate that Abraham Lincoln was elected president 2 weeks ago, and he won't be inaugurated for months. And states like Georgia and South Carolina are already well underway to deciding the validity of secession for their states. Lincoln, for his part, was described today by a newspaper reporter that was kind of following him around this time as being, quote, undisturbed by the news from the South, and he still felt that secession would not be attempted. Ironically, the first secession meeting in South Carolina would happen the very next day in Chesterfield on November 19th. That same day, Monday, the last of the debates in Georgia would be held. The speaker on the last day was one Henry Benning. Henry was a congressman and a lawyer from Georgia. And after having two pro secession speakers followed by two anti secession speakers, the Milledgeville State Legislature finally wrapped things up with one more pro secessionist. Benning's speech seemed much more based on the fear that a Republican government, if brought into the office, would push for the immediate and complete abolition of the slaves. In his speech, he stated that abolition would be, quote, to the South, one of the direst evils of which the mind can conceive. The decree will excite an intense hatred between the whites on one side and the slaves in the North on the other. Very soon, a war between the whites and the blacks will spontaneously break out everywhere. It will be in every town, in every village, in every neighborhood, and in every road. Now, on the surface, you listen to something like that from Henry Benning, and it sounds like just fear mongering. And honestly, Benning is trying to convince an audience of something. This may have very well been what it was. But Benning is taking advantage of something that was very real in the South, a very real subconscious fear that existed. And this fear was not anything new to people in the South or people that were associated with the institution of slavery from the founding of the country. And this fear was what slaves would do if they were immediately and unconditionally set free. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, the person that wrote that all men were created equal, struggled with this issue himself. He once wrote that slavery was like holding a wolf by its ears. You didn't like it, but you didn't dare let it go. That full quote of Jefferson's is, quote, but as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale, and self-preservation is in the other. And as much as they may try to deny it, there was always this subconscious fear in the back of Southerners' minds that their slaves were harboring this resentment, and if set free unconditionally and all at once, they may attack them. And I know today there's going to be people that listen to something like that and scoff at it. But I don't want us to fall into the trap of this chronological snobbery that we tend to have towards people in the past. Thomas Jefferson and a lot of people in the South are wrestling with a very real moral dilemma. And I think it would be disingenuous of us to not at least attempt to put ourselves in their shoes. And it's not as though Southerners didn't have their fair share of horror stories to pull from as well for that fear to creep into the back of their minds. And it was definitely enough to worry them about what the effects of an immediate and complete abolition would be. For example, in living memory, the Haitian Revolution had occurred, in which a slave revolt rose up against the French slaveholding aristocracy in 1791, and it was a national nightmare where about 4,000 slaveholders and other white French colonists were killed over a course of 10 days by over 100,000 revolting slaves. In 1791, when that happened, Haiti was home to about 500,000 slaves. By comparison, the American Deep South in 1860 had nearly 4 million. In the 60 years from 1800 up to the day of Lincoln's election, there had been at least 9 planned or executed slave revolts in the Deep South, including Nat Turner's Rebellion, which left about 60 people dead in 1831, and more recently, in 1859, John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry. And so there was this undercurrent of paranoia that existed in the South about what exactly ex-slaves would do if they were suddenly given their freedom. So anyway, Benning is really playing on a deep-seated and long-standing fear that existed in the Deep South. You'll remember that I mentioned last week and at the top of this episode that President Buchanan last week asked his Attorney General, whose name is Jeremiah Black, a number of questions, all pertaining to his responsibility and his power to act in response to what was happening in South Carolina. Now, on Tuesday, Sullivan Black gives his opinion to the president. Black tells Buchanan that the states are subject to the laws of the United States while they are in the Union, and that the president can collect duties and protect public property despite resistance, and that in fact that was his responsibility. However, he said the president could not bring force against those who only opposed the government with talk. And he made sure to stress that all law enforcement must be done through the courts. In short, the government could repel aggression, but it can't wage an offensive war against a state. It's forced only to act on the defensive. And this was a legal question that had not been broached by the founding fathers when the Union was being put together. But it has sort of this natural logic to it, right? The question is, can states who had voted and chosen to join a union of states decide whenever they want to that they don't want to be part of that union anymore? A lot of southern states argued that they could. And this wasn't an idea that was unique to the southern states. Plenty of other states around the Union had threatened to secede from the Union if things didn't go their way before. Recently, we had mentioned during the War of 1812, the New England states were the ones grumbling about leaving the Union. But it had never been quite put to the test the way that it is now. The argument from the Deep South now is that the Union is like a voluntary contract of cooperation. And any attempt from the federal government to try to stop them from leaving when they wanted to would be like being involved in a hostage situation. Meanwhile, your hardcore unionists would be saying that, no, you join the union, and it is a perpetual union, never to be broken. Regardless, there is sure to be much more debating as we continue on through our time. On Wednesday this week, the 21st, Lincoln boards a train in Springfield bound for Chicago. He's going there to meet his vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, for the very first time. At that time, presidential and vice presidential candidates were nominated independently of each other by their party. Lincoln had never been properly introduced to Hannibal Hamlin, and the closest they had been to meeting was when they had both served in Congress in 1849. Hamlin was a senator, and Lincoln was a congressman. In fact, 2 days after being elected, Lincoln reached out to Hamlin saying, quote, "My dear sir, it appears to me that you and I ought to be acquainted, and accordingly, I write this as a sort of introduction of myself to you." The trip was an eventful one for Lincoln. He traveled with his wife, Mary, and some friends. Among them was Senator Lyman Trumbull. It was noted that they weren't shown much hospitality. The train car that the group was put in was shared with 3 other passengers, 2 of them prisoners, 1 convicted of murder, and the third, the sheriff, who had voted for Lincoln's opponent, Stephen Douglas, in the election. The train stopped multiple times along the way, but Lincoln mostly asked to be excused from speech making to the crowds that had gathered to see him on the platforms. And then finally, late that night, in the Tremont House Hotel, Lincoln was formally introduced to his vice president for the first time. Hannibal Hamlin later would write about their conversation. This is a conversation between Lincoln and Hamlin. Quote, "Have we ever been introduced to each other, Mr. Hamlin?" Lincoln asked. "No, sir, I think not," Hamlin replied. "That is also my impression, but I remember distinctly when I was in Congress to have heard you make a speech in the Senate. I was very much struck with that speech, Senator, particularly struck with it, and for the reason that it was filled chock up with the very best kind of anti-slavery doctrine," said Lincoln. "Well, now, that is very singular," Hamlin mused. "For my one and first recollection of yourself is having heard you make a speech in the House. A speech that was so full of good humor and sharp points that I, together with other of your auditors, was convulsed with laughter, and I see that you and I remain in accord on our anti-slavery principles." The men with their entourage toured parts of Chicago and even bought their suits for the inauguration. Lincoln's would consist of a black cashmere pant, black silk vest, and a black coat with the inscription, "To the Honorable Abraham Lincoln" on the collar. But the two didn't waste much time because they had a cabinet to construct. That same night, Lincoln and Hamlin met with various politicians, among them Congressman William Kellogg, Carl Schurz, Senator Trumbull, and Don Piatt. A lot of names that evening were thrown out for potential cabinet members. Among them were the current Ohio Governor Salmon P. Chase, Gideon Welles of Connecticut, Henry Davis from Maryland, Congressman Robert Schenck of Ohio, and perhaps most importantly, Senator William Seward of New York. Prior to Lincoln's nomination for president, the Republican Party almost nominated William Seward. At this time, he is currently considered the top politician in the Republican Party. It was a normal gesture to offer the leading figure of a political party the position of Secretary of State if your party won the presidency. But controversially, Lincoln hadn't even invited Seward to the meeting in Chicago. He was subsequently contacted by Seward's political manager, a man named Thurlow Weed. Weed, while talking to Lincoln, made it clear that he was expecting that Seward would be offered the highest cabinet position. He claimed that Seward would decline it, but that the, quote, "courtesy is due to Mr. Seward and to New York." Not much is recorded about the actual words spoken during this meeting between Lincoln and Hamlin, but the results of this meeting will soon be made apparent to everybody. The next morning, Thursday, the two will hold a public reception hosting 3,000 people, all of whom will have had to brave a snowstorm to meet the president and the vice president-elect. While that crowd was gathering in Chicago, another type of crowd was gathering in Abbeville, South Carolina. On what is now known as Secession Hill, a group of citizens elected representatives to represent them in the secession convention that was already scheduled for December 17th. And then on Friday, Major Robert Anderson of the U.S. Army finally arrives in Charleston, South Carolina to take command over the small garrison at Fort Moultrie. Anderson himself had graduated from West Point and then gone on to participate in the Indian Wars, the Seminole Wars in Florida, and the Mexican-American War as an artillery officer. He had also been given battlefield promotions twice, so he was no stranger to conflict. But this wasn't the only reason that Robert Anderson was chosen for the post at Fort Moultrie. This was a very calculated move by the Army. Robert Anderson is from Kentucky. He's known to be pro-slavery, and he's married to a woman from Georgia. However, he is also a very loyal, dedicated Army officer, and his loyalty to the Union is unquestioned. Anderson is actually given command of 3 forts in Charleston Harbor. There's Fort Moultrie, where his garrison currently resides. Then there's Castle Pinckney. Castle Pinckney is in even worse shape than Fort Moultrie, and it is far closer to Charleston, definitely within cannon shot. The third one is an unfinished brick mason fort, kind of in the style of those that T.A. Craven is guarding in the Florida Keys, by the name of Fort Sumter. Anderson spent the first few days that he was there just going over and surveying his position. He reported back that he thought the fort would make a, quote, very handsome defense if the garrison was brought up to strength, but he thought the current garrison of 70 men was so weak that they were practically inviting people to attack them. And he noted that an attack like that was being, quote, openly and publicly threatened. South Carolina militiamen, in the course of the next couple weeks, are going to assemble and patrol the village outside of Fort Moultrie called Moultrieville. And in the harbor, patrol boats are beginning to make their rounds, just kind of keeping an eye on the federal garrisons. General Anderson said in his report that if Moultrie was assailed, it would not be able to hold out for very long. Now, being the artillery soldier that he is, Major Anderson prefers Fort Sumter in the middle of the harbor. Sumter, like we mentioned before, is still incomplete, and a lot of its guns aren't even mounted yet. However, Anderson did call it, quote, the key to the entrance of the harbor. Now, nearly as soon as he got there, he wanted to garrison Sumter immediately, as well as Castle Pinckney, which held a commanding view of the town. And he wasn't trying to provoke anybody by doing this. He actually desperately wanted to avoid a clash and argued that in his report, quote, nothing will be better calculated to prevent bloodshed than our being found in such an attitude that it would be madness and folly to attack us. Major Anderson reported a spirit of settled determination in Charleston to leave the Union. He thought that the matter was practically settled already as far as the hearts of the people in Charleston were considered. Quote, the clouds are threatening and the storms may break upon us at any moment, he wrote to his superiors. Anderson would also begin a very long line of repeated requests for reinforcements almost as soon as he arrived at Moultrie. However, the U.S. Army that we're dealing with in 1860 is not the U.S. Army that we are experiencing in 2024. In 1860, the entire standing U.S. Army numbered 16,000 men, and almost all of those were scattered across the western frontier. These people were nowhere near South Carolina. And this makes sense. I mean, Americans in the early republic viewed large standing armies as a threat to personal liberty. They had had so much bad experience with the British Army. And so whenever a conflict had broken out in America, they had relied on large groups of volunteer soldiers and trained militias to fill out the regular army. It was actually seen as a responsibility of the citizens to keep a well-drilled and organized local militia just in the event of any sort of conflict. However, even if there were reinforcements on hand, it's very doubtful that Major Anderson would have received any, because the man he's ultimately asking is Secretary of War John B. Floyd right now. Floyd had been the governor of Virginia and a very practiced lawyer before becoming President Buchanan's Secretary of War. Now, Floyd never publicly endorsed secession. However, for the last year or so since John Brown's raid into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, he's been using his position as Secretary of War to begin to shift over 100,000 rifles and muskets to federal arsenals located in the south of the country. He's also participated in a slight bit of nepotism by having his cousin by marriage, Joseph E. Johnston, raised to the position of Quartermaster General of the Army, despite being outranked by a few other officers. And now to round off the week, November 24th, Saturday, representatives from Houston County, Texas, send a letter to Governor Sam Houston, famous hero of the Texas Revolution and first president of the Republic of Texas. They're asking him to convene the state legislature in view of Lincoln's election. The entire letter reads like this. It's dated Houston County, Texas, November 24th, 1860, to His Excellency Sam Houston, Governor of the State of Texas. The undersigned, your petitioners, most respectfully represent that the election of Abraham Lincoln, a black Republican, to the Chief Magistracy of the United States upon the principles of aroused hostility to the South, and in palpable violation of the sacred compact of the Union, has filled their minds with the most gloomy apprehensions for the fate of the institution of slavery and the constitutional rights and privileges. They therefore hope that Your Excellency will consider the alarming exigency of the times and convene the legislature forthwith to the end that such measures may be adopted as the rights of self-preservation now demand, and your petitioners will ever pray, etc., etc. There are all of the signatures underneath. And I include that for a couple reasons. One, there's just not a whole lot happening on Saturday the 24th. Two, I just thought it was really cool to realize that Sam Houston from the state of Texas, the man who participated in the Texas Revolution in 1860, is the acting governor of Texas. How cool is that? But anyway, that is where our week this week ends. We have President-elect Abraham Lincoln meeting his vice president for the first time, current President Buchanan getting some clarification on his responsibilities, and new commanding officer Major Robert Anderson in Fort Moultrie gloomily assessing his new situation. And all the while, newspapers and editors across the country spewing all sorts of political diatribes to the common man. But hey, this will all blow over and cooler heads will prevail. Right? If you enjoyed the show, please consider liking, giving a review, giving a star rating. Anything that you can do will really help the show out, and I really appreciate it. Civil War Weekly is a one-man project. It is recorded, researched, and edited just by myself, and I appreciate all of the support that you guys have given me so far. If you would like to reach out with any cool details of your own, or if you have some ideas for things that I would not want to skip over in any coming weeks, you can reach out to the show at civilwarweekly@gmail.com. And if you know anybody who might be interested in American history or just this particular aspect of American history, consider sharing the show with a friend. Once again, thank you all for listening, and I will see you next week for more Civil War Weekly.